Our second interview in season 2 focuses on the global policy-making process that leads to climate policy. We talked to Arthur Lee, who, as an industry representative to the IPCC and UNFCCC for several decades, helps us decode all the acronyms and look behind the headlines on how the work to build collaboration between more than 100 countries and countless other stakeholders unfolds at meetings like the annual COP Conference of Parties. The IPCC was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007, and Mr. Lee was awarded a certificate of recognition by the IPCC for his contributions to the Nobel Peace Prize. Talking to a Nobel Peace Prize winner was a real treat. Hi, Arthur. Thank you so much for joining us today on this episode of this podcast. Before we begin, I want to ask you first, could you tell us a little bit about your career at Chevron and relate your experiences to how your career evolved into what you did on climate change and the energy transition?
Oh, Miller, thank you. First of all, let me thank you and Roshan, and of course Jim Crompton, who's not on camera at this moment, but in the background, for inviting me to be on this podcast. I'm truly honored to be able to address your audience at USC and whoever else you would have beyond. So thank you. Yes, my career. I am retired now. I just want to be clear. I am retired. I actually retired in on August 1, just a couple of months ago. So I am retired, but I worked for Chevron for 31 years. Yeah, 31, a little bit more than 31 years. And I also, I was actually an experienced hire into Chevron. This has a little bit of a background to it because after graduate school at a school not too far up the road from USC, I got my master's in chemical engineering from Caltech. And before that, I got my also chemical engineering, but bachelor's at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT. So, really started out as a student, chemical engineering student, like you are, Miller, and I thought, well, that would be my career to try to be a chemical engineer at DuPont or 3M or somewhere, where they make chemicals. That's my very simplistic thinking in those days. And this was back, of course, in 1985 when I graduated from MIT. So you can kind of estimate how old I am. Uh, so uh, that's what I thought my career trajectory would be like. But as it turns out, after Caltech, I actually went into the defense field, military technologies, and I worked for 3 years at a small consulting firm that did work mostly, actually all classified work for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or popularly known as DARPA. And other clients included the Office of Naval Research, Naval Surface Warfare Command. And actually, in those days, it was one of the first agencies called the Naval Space Warfare Command, SPAWAR, and also for the Air Force Office of Scientific Research. So the kind of work I did, all classified, but really talked about. I can talk a little bit about the fact that they had to do with work on nuclear weapons, and also on a little bit on nuclear power, actually something that could be derived from some of that nuclear weapons technology into nuclear power. But anyway, so I did work in that area for 3 years, actually. I devoted 3 years of my life to that, but not anywhere close to the kind of work that I ended up doing for 31 years. And then I worked. I stayed in California and worked for Fluor Daniel, which is also in Southern California, as a chemical engineer, chemical process engineer. getting back to my roots. That's when I thought I would be doing, becoming much more of a traditional chemical engineer, doing understanding and applying kinetics, of course, thermodynamics, and using simulators like HYSYS, HYSYM in those days, and also HYSYM and all that to simulate processes for refining and in my case, I actually was in at Fluor Daniels Advanced Technology Division. So at Fluor, I actually worked on some of their more advanced, so-called advanced technology deployment things for DOE, which included molten carbonate fuel cell. So that was my first inkling and first contact, if you will, with newer technologies, not just coal-fired boilers or refining process units, but into more into fuel cells. That was one of my first contact. So after that, for personal reasons, I had to move back to Washington, D.C. Like I said, I worked for DARPA in the early days, and then moved back to DC and started working for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. My wife then was my fiance, actually had a lot of influence on that. In fact, she basically changed my career. She asked me to come back to Washington, D.C., and I got two job offers. One was with the U.S. DOE to clean up nuclear waste, and the other was to join the U.S. EPA. So I thought, well, nuclear waste wasn't too interesting to me, so I joined the EPA, and my career trajectory from that point on actually changed dramatically. I was really no longer an engineer, but I got into the world of policy. In fact, I became a regulator. I actually wrote regulations for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, regulations that would control NOx emissions from coal-fired power plants. Okay, so this was in the early days of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. Uh, so so once that was enacted by Congress, there was a whole raft of regulations that has to be written by the EPA, and I was hired into that one of the first waves after in 1991, actually one of the first waves of hiring into EPA. And the funny enough, with my experience already in industry, I was actually the most experienced person. Everyone else just got their bachelor's, and I actually have a master's and worked in industry for a few years already. So they made me kind of they made me the leader of a team that actually wrote the NOx regulations for power plants. I still remember the CFR 40 CFR, Chapter 40, Code of Federal Regulations. Part 76. So if you ever look it up, 40 CFR Part 76, I actually wrote a lot of that so with my team. So anyway, so yeah, that's how I got into policy, and that start to relate now to my role later on at Chevron. Okay, for 5 years, I was hired into Texaco, which of course later became Chevron Texaco and then Chevron. I was hired into Texaco as a lobbyist. Okay, so I'm not a congressional lobbyist. I don't go to Capitol Hill to lobby, but I did do a lot of lobbying directly with the EPA and also as part of the American Petroleum Institute and other business groups that lobbied in Washington, D.C. So I was very familiar with the Washington, D.C. K Street lobbyist scene in that sense. So from an engineer, chemical engineer, when I thought I would just be a fluid annual chemical engineer for the rest of my career, I changed completely into a technical lobbying role, policy role, policy advocacy, all of that at Texaco. No longer an engineer, but that's how it changed for me. And then after 5 years, this is where to me the another big change in my career was when my Texaco management at the time asked me a couple of simple questions. What is greenhouse gas emission? What is that? So they thought that, okay, well, you're an air pollution guy, maybe you know something about it. Give it to Arthur. So yeah, they gave the whole role to me to look at greenhouse gas emissions. And to understand it, of course, I also have to not only the science, but I also have to understand the treaty that was just passed or agreed to in 1997 in December. So in January 1998, I was given this assignment to understand all about greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, and why is it that Indonesia is thinking of planting more trees, right around our facilities, and also one of our competitors, Exxon, why are they thinking of injecting carbon dioxide into the Natuna Sea, offshore into the Natuna Sea, because in one of their fields they're experiencing or will experience, I think 70%, 70%, okay, 70% carbon dioxide in the gas field, in the natural gas field, and they want to or need to re-inject that CO2 into the seabed of the Tuna Sea. So my management just simply asked me these simple questions. Let's find out more about that from a business angle. Why is Exxon wanting to do that, and why is the government in Indonesia wanting to plant trees, and what is this thing called greenhouse gas emissions? So. So from very basic, very humble, very basic beginnings, I had no idea what any of this meant, right? So that's how I started. Um, and then in 1999, I started going to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC negotiations. I realized there's a whole big world out of this issue from just those three simple questions. And I needed to be part of that observing process, and I did. I went there as part of a business group to observe the process. So that's how my career came about from a simple chemical engineer and no longer chemical engineer into be a lobbyist and looking at policy issues and in fact global policy issues from domestic U.S. to global policy issues. So.
Wow, thank you.
You've had actually a really interesting career so far, but you
Yeah.
talked about it a little bit, but can you tell us what you've seen at your time at the UNFCCC?
Yeah, exactly. I started in 1999 when I realized that, wow, there's this thing called a Kyoto Protocol. Obviously, that was one of the initial questions. What is this Kyoto Protocol? What's greenhouse gas management? What's Kyoto Protocol? So it was because of the Kyoto Protocol that Indonesia started thinking about replanting forests, some of the forest that has been deforested, especially around our operations that we had no control over. It was all deforested by the people who live there, who conducting the slash and burn agriculture because they needed to make a living. There's some of these folks, they're not necessarily the landowners, but if they own the land or whether or not they did, simply they carried out slash and burn. You cut down the trees and then you start planting, and you burn the trees, and you start planting so that you can feed your families. So that got me then into the whole world of okay, if one country can do that, and the pollution, not only the criteria, health criteria, air pollutants, but also CO2 is global. Okay, what's next, right? So it's all about the global treaty called the Kyoto Protocol at that time, which derives from the UNFCCC. Okay, I know this gets into a lot of details, but the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, as I learned that year, I learned about it. I started doing all my reading very quickly on that. UNFCCC was agreed to in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. And then in 1994, it came into force as international law. And I think it came into force as international law based on, say, I think 55% of the emissions from at least 55 countries signed up to it. I think that was the criteria that used to make the law come into effect. So as international law, what that means is countries that have signed up to it and then ratified a treaty, including the United States, by the way. The U.S. actually ratified the UNFCCC back in like 94. Once it's ratified, that means each country has to agree to or commit itself to passing policies, legislation, regulation, however its institutions do it, to implement the rules as they are spelled out in the UNFCCC. Now, okay, having said that, implementation becomes the big issues. There are many issues to deal with in the UNFCCC, which then in 1995, the first meeting of the parties to the UNFCCC called Conference of Parties. Now, this is not anything that you would think of as a conference that chemical engineers or electrical engineers think of as a conference. You know, you go to a business or industry conference, you hear talks and you exchange ideas and read papers and all that. This conference is actually negotiations between 184 plus countries. Okay. So when the UN say something is a conference, the Conference of Parties actually mean the parties to the UN Framework Convention. They are the countries that now agree to come every year to have this COP meeting, Conference of Parties. So I started going at COP 5. COP 5 was in 1999. So that was I picked up this assignment in January 1998. So almost immediately, like the next year, 1999, I was sent to Bonn, Germany, for my first COP meeting, and that was COP 5 in 1999. So it's really been a journey in looking at these negotiations, because what happens is this UN Framework Convention, I think I recall, is really about maybe 40 pages of A4, the European format page. I don't even know if people use paper these days, but the about 40 pages or so of the UN Framework Convention. But to implement it, you actually have, just like any U.S. laws implemented by the U.S. EPA or U.S. FDA or whatever, you then write regulations to each article. So that's in fact what happens. Now, who will write these regulations, right? So nobody can write these regulations, because the way the COP works is that every country has a voice. And so every year they have to come to late November, early December, a summit meeting for all 180 plus countries that have signed on to and ratified the UNFCCC. They have to decide. So imagine 180 people, now in this case, 184 countries. They have to get together and actually agree to every single issue that will be negotiated to implement the UN Framework Convention. So for 3 years they couldn't do it, and in 1997, that's when they then got something done called the Kyoto Protocol. And the Kyoto Protocol is like a precursor to the Paris Agreement that's much more famous these days. The Kyoto Protocol was what motivated countries like Indonesia to do reforestation, because in the Kyoto Protocol there is a single provision, Article 12 actually, Article 12 of the Kyoto Protocol, that encourages countries to do something called the Clean Development Mechanism, to use this UN mechanism to generate carbon offsets, so that you can plant trees as an offset to some emission elsewhere. Okay, so that's what I'm just giving you just a tiny bit of flavor of something that persists then throughout and became part of the Paris Agreement as well. Carbon offsetting, international emission trading, all of that then later translated, 18 years later, translated into the Paris Agreement, which is also now undergoing its own annual implementation negotiations. That's why you hear all these talk every year, towards around this time of year, November, early December, always. There's always in the news, oh, countries are getting back together. And you would wonder, why the heck are these countries always coming back together every year? Don't they already have a Paris Agreement? Well, yes, they do, but the Paris Agreement is only, again, like around 40 pages. And they're now writing hundreds of pages of regulations, so to speak. And each of these provisions in the regulation have to be agreed to by each country. Okay, can you imagine that? There's and there's no voting. Okay, I'll add another wrinkle onto that. There's no voting.
How does it
So
get agreed?
yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So how does it get agreed to if there's no?
Yes. See, that's the question. No voting. Okay. Let me ask you a question to think about this. If there's which country would object to voting? Somebody actually in 1995, some country actually proposed, hey, we should have a voting mechanism. And guess which countries opposed voting?
Probably be the most influential ones, I would assume, like maybe the US and China, Russia, if they're there, and like the UK, stuff like that. Like those gigantic companies that have countries that
Yeah, you got the right idea. It's the United States and the European Union.
yeah.
Both parties. EU is considered one party. Both parties objected vehemently to voting. So every year when some country suggests let's try voting again, they would put it on the agenda. They try to put it on the agenda. And me being an observer, as a later observer, more experienced observer, then I realized, and I chuckle to myself, oh, here goes another attempt at this. No, there's no voting. Okay, so how do they agree? Yes, that is the trillion-dollar question. To agree to anything, okay, everything is done by consensus. Now, can you imagine what consensus means? Now, there's no unanimity, okay?
So
Unanimity is different from consensus. I think you
yeah.
you understand that, right? Consensus simply means all the parties in the room, in the big COP conference room, and the COP conference rooms are like a couple of football field size, okay? Uh, all the countries have to agree not to object. That's what consensus is, okay? They don't have to, they don't have to love it. And certainly behind the scenes, a lot of countries grumble at one issue or another. But at the plenary, in the final day of the final week, if anyone really objects, they could derail the whole conference. Okay, so all of the issues individually, as they go through the 2 weeks, and this is a 2 week COP, it's always 2 weeks. As they go through the 2 weeks, they would agree to disagree sometimes, but they would agree to live with it, live with something. Okay. So at the final plenary, the chair or the president, if you will, you hear a lot about the presidency. In this case, COP29 will be at Baku. So I think not the prime minister, but the minister of like petroleum resources, okay, is the president of COP, and he will gavel down a decision. Once he read out what the decision is, and if he takes a quick look around the auditorium and there's no one raising their flag and saying, no, no, I object, he gavels it, decision is done. Okay. So in the past 20 plus years, some presidents are very fast, very fast. They don't even take a look. They said, okay, consensus, and then gavel the decision. And that's because most of the jawboning negotiations and dissatisfaction have already been expressed in the smaller conference room between countries. And if they were able to get past those levels, then at the final, they shouldn't have any big objections. Okay. Although occasionally there has been some countries who would do that. I've seen that several times. In fact, at COP26 in Glasgow, the presidency was held by the UK, United Kingdom. I forgot his name now, but anyway, the Minister of Climate Change, basically, for the UK. His face kind of blanched. Okay, when China and India both spoke up and said, "We don't like this, we don't like that." So his face blanched because he thought he had an agreement on some of the final decision over the phrase. Let's see, the phrase was phase out of coal. Okay, phase out of coal. Okay, so that was one little phrase. Okay, but it was a huge phrase for India and China. They don't want phase out. They want phase down. So they offered an alternative. They want phase down. And of course, you know the difference, right? Phase out, of course, means zero. At the end, you get zero. No more coal use. But phase down, it depends on how long you can lengthen the duration of that phase down period. It may never go to zero. Okay, so China, India insisted on phase down. Okay, and they got it. Okay, and they got it as the final compromise. So that and that issue was raised again in UAE at the UAE COP 2027 at UAE, and I saw it again, and the presidency at that time was a little bit more prepared. So they kind of allowed it, but also got more out of the other countries too, tripling the renewable energy, the proportion of renewable energy to be developed by countries, including tripling energy, doubling energy efficiency, tripling renewable energy, and also accelerating the deployment of carbon capture and geologic storage, and accelerating the deployment of nuclear energy. Okay, so all that were also accepted, and then one group also tried to derail the whole thing. But that group also then later got what it wanted. That was the African group. The African group basically said, "Okay, well, we have lots of natural gas here, especially in the West Africa. We have lots of natural gas, so we need to develop it. Our country, we need those resources. We need to develop it. We're not rich like you guys in the Western world. We need to develop it, and if you don't let us develop it, we're going to derail all this negotiation." And they threatened to do that very seriously. So they got what they wanted. They added a paragraph 29 that basically said transitional fuels. And the code word transitional fuels really stands for natural gas. Is that transitional fuels is recognized as an energy security matter, and that it should continue to be developed for as long as needed, or something like that, consistent with climate change impacts. So along those lines, the African group got what it wanted, and all the countries were able to leave COP28 saying that they got a successful outcome. Okay, so that's the art of compromise.
Yeah.
Everyone got what it wanted, and not no everybody got some of what it wanted, and not all of what it really wanted. But that's compromise. Okay? That's the art of compromise in the international arena. Okay.
Wow, that's incredible. And I have to ask, just out of curiosity,
Yeah.
how long would these processes take from like the start of negotiation, day
Yeah.
one, to once everybody reaches a consensus?
Yeah. I was about to bore you all with sharing my screen. Um, if you want, I can actually
Please,
bore you
yeah.
a little bit. I'll show you what this is just one agenda. Okay. So let me share. Okay, here, share. Because to prepare for this podcast, I actually looked at. I never thought, after retiring, I would look at these agendas ever again. But for this podcast, I decided, okay, why not? I'll look at it. Okay, are you able to see it now?
Yes, now we're able to see it.
Okay, good, very good. Okay, so this is just the COP. Now, there's some subtlety to this. The COP is actually I say it's 2 weeks of COP. Actually, there's several things going on here. It's not just the Conference of Parties. There's something CMP as well. Oops, what's going on? Don't send. Okay, can you still see me?
Yes.
Okay, some reason Zoom is giving me this error message. Okay, okay, all right. Right. So this is just one agenda. Okay, there are actually several meetings going on in parallel. COP is the ultimate, the supreme body of the whole process. Like I said before, the 184 countries, there's no executive committee of countries that would decide things for everybody. Everyone, every single country, from your tiny little country of Vanuatu and Bhutan and all that, to the great big United States and the European Union and China. No, no one is dominates the whole thing. In fact, I'll say one thing, and I'll quit on this. Is that because these small countries they cannot be everywhere at once. Imagine what you do. Okay, the U.S. Bring in to every COP, bring in two, three, at least 200 negotiators. Okay, something like that. EU, the same thing. They bring in like 200 negotiators, 300. China too now has brought in close to like 300 also. Okay, so imagine you're a small country, you're Vanuatu. You go there as one person or maybe at most two. So how can you negotiate these 50 to 70 issues all at once? Okay. How can you do that? Okay, so let me ask you, how would you think about doing that?
Um, Blanket statements maybe, and just trying to maybe just stay firm on your the ideas that you brought to the thing. I don't think you can pivot much if there's 200 people that you have to talk to.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, you got the right idea. That's the approach. What they do is they bring their positions on the issues they are completely aware of, okay? And then they leverage that to blocks. Okay, so there are blocks of countries that are negotiating. So the biggest block in the UN in this UN process is called the G77 plus China. That's the biggest block, and they always speak first. The United Nations have, by tradition now, by process, have given them the right to speak, always speak first because the group of 77 countries plus China is the biggest bloc. So if you belong to that, you can kind of delegate your issue to this bloc, make sure that you are heard in the bloc meetings, and then once your issue is heard, then you can go off on your own and do the issues that perhaps you care most about and negotiate those directly in the smaller rooms. But on some of these big issues that you delegate it to someone else to speak for you. Okay, so that's how it actually works in the dynamics of the negotiations. And this COP, okay, is just one agenda. All right, so none of these will mean anything to you, but I just want to show you that in the COP itself there are subsidiary bodies for scientific and technological advice. I often go to the SBSTA meetings. That's what people call SBSTA, SBSTA. And then there's also the subsidiary body for implementation. These subsidiary bodies, what they do is in June, they also meet in the June of the year. They also meet to negotiate, hash out many of the details, and then put it as negotiating text so that in late November, December, those then would be negotiated at the COP level. Okay, the subsidiary bodies, all that is it's not different. It's not any different countries. It's the same countries, the same 180 plus countries, but at a professional level. So imagine somebody like me, okay? I consider myself a professional person. I'm not a diplomat. I'm not a Secretary of State, okay? Uh, like, uh, 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 yeah, I'm not a Secretary of State or Minister of Prime or Minister of Environment. So at the professional level, countries governments send out people from the EPA or from NOAA or from the DOE to negotiate specific issues. So these are the professional at that level. They would negotiate in the subsidiary body level. And in June, they set up the table, set up the negotiating text so that in the summit, the COP summit, they would then negotiate further in the first week, okay, first of the second of the 2 weeks. They would negotiate further, try to, tie up all the loose ends, and then present the negotiating text for the second week. For the second week, for the ministers at the ministerial level, for them to put together the entire package for that summit. Okay, so for example, the UAE did that at COP 27 at the at UAE at Dubai. This year is Azerbaijan. I think the Minister of Petroleum Resources, Environment, etc. He's the one now putting together his diplomats to do that second week negotiations. Now, there's a subtlety here that I should mention, but you should be aware of this. The first week is professionals, okay? Second week is when the presidency, okay, the president of the COP, his or her job is not to completely drive the agenda and try to put his or her stamp, country's stamp on the agreement. They cannot do that. Okay. In fact, when you become the president of a COP, you kind of give up your right to negotiate. You sort of delegate a lot of those issues to your bloc to let them negotiate for you. Okay. Because as a president, you actually have to become neutral. I'll let that sink in. You have to become neutral, and you send out your diplomatic corps, your diplomats, to all these smaller meetings to mediate. So your job as president actually is not to try to bias the outcome one way or the other. I mean, subtly they might, but your job actually to make it successful, you send out your diplomats to make sure to mediate all the disagreements that have cropped up in the first week and still remain in the second week. So for example, last year when a lot of students and environmentalists and others protested that basically the CEO of ADNOC, the national oil company for Abu Dhabi, became the president of COP. Everyone said, "Oh my goodness, the COP is going to be a travesty. It's going to be a bad thing. Come out be oil and gas." But no, actually, the point is, these are folks who either don't know the process or simply want to mislead the public about it. The presidency actually has a crucial job of making sure the negotiations are successful. They cannot try to drive it and then have it fall apart. Okay, so I'll leave it there as the final answer of that. Okay.
Wow, there's a lot that goes into it.
Yes.
I think it was complicated, actually, but it seems way more political and less technical than I thought.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes. But it's still technical. Okay, there's still a lot of technical basis, and this is where I know you're not asking the question, but I participate in the IPCC process as well, and I can talk about the process. The IPCC is a parallel process. It's not part of the UNFCCC, but it's mostly the same countries anyway. At least or close to 100 member countries are in the IPCC as well. These are the countries who can nominate their scientists to assess the actual science, the literature. It's almost like a super peer review process that goes on for at least 5 to 7 years. And the sixth assessment that was completed in 2023, 2024 became the basis for COP27 and COP26 and COP27. And so for the next 5 to 7 years, the seventh assessment period will coincide more or less with, I don't know, COP32 or something. So at that time, then more of these negotiations will have to base their issues more or less on the scientific basis that will be assessed by the whole IPCC process that has restarted again. Okay. That's restarted earlier this year. In fact, I went to the seventh assessment planning IPCC meeting back in January before I retired. Back in January in Istanbul in Turkey. So I observed that as well to see where they were going with that. So as process-wise, the two, even though they're parallel, have different UN processes, but the UNFCCC has made itself sort of the superior process and can require the IPCC to do certain things, to assess certain things and do certain things, such as requiring like special reports. So they've done that for the 1.5 degree global warming in 2018. So the IPCC was required by the UNFCCC to do that assessment, and that report came out in 2018, for example. So that's how the two processes work, okay? Even though they're separate and distinct from each other, the IPCC actually is a combination or joint venture of the World Meteorological Organization, which itself is a UN body, and also a co-venture of the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP. Okay, so UNEP and WMO, the two organizations, a little bit of history. Back in 1988. That's when the first IPCC meeting was held, and then the first assessment of the science came out in 1990. So, and I started participating in that process informally in the third assessment, and then I participated formally in the fourth assessment, and I skipped the fifth assessment, although I did do a lot of reviews. And then I became formally a participant again as a review editor, just like I was in the fourth assessment. In the sixth assessment, I was a review editor again in the sixth assessment. Okay, so I'm retired now. I won't be participating anymore in any more assessment. Yeah, but that's how that works as well. Just to give you a flavor of why the science is important, because in the COP decisions back COP 27 in UAE, they actually had like a whole page or 2 pages of a decision around the science. Okay, not only recognizing it, but promoting more of the science and making sure that the decisions are aligned on policy and technology development, are more aligned to the scientific basis for the negotiations. Okay.
And it's been over 17 years since the IPCC
Yeah.
was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. You were awarded a certificate of recognition by the IPCC for your contribution to the Nobel Peace
Right.
Prize. What are your thoughts about the impact of the prize recognition to you?
Well, it's been good, very positive. So that's short of it, long and short of it. But let me just say this too. I was very surprised when in 2007, in October, actually, just basically, every October, early October 1st or second week is Nobel Prize week, right? So that week I was kind of I always pay attention to the Nobel Prizes just as a matter of curiosity and also a matter of learning. I like to understand, especially the chemistry and physics prize. I'm not so good or understanding of all the physiology and medicine prize or the other prizes, but I always pay attention to the physics and chemistry. So that year I thought, wow, the chemistry prize was awarded to this professor in Germany who basically was the founding father of the field of surface physics, surface chemistry. So I was very happy to see that. And then a couple of days later, and when I went into the office and I saw all these emails, saying something, and then all these emails, I think must have gone over 100 emails, all talking about the same thing, about the IPCC was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. I thought to myself, oh my God, this is really a surprise. In fact, it was quite a shock that the organization itself got a prize, and it was shared. Of course, the prize was shared with former Vice President Al Gore, uh, who actually famously flew to Kyoto in 1997 to clinch that deal on the Kyoto Protocol. That's an aside, okay? But but the IPCC shared the Nobel Peace Prize with former Vice President Gore. And I was just shocked that people were recognized, but I didn't think too much of it afterwards. Not too much. And then the IPCC then sent 2 days later sent an email to all of us who participated in the IPCC and said, "You are all recognized," and it carried through that promise by actually sending us this huge certificate. The top half is actually is a replica of the Nobel Peace Prize 2007 itself. Okay, and the bottom half of this huge thing is says something about IPCC recognizes me, Arthur Lee, for contributing to the Nobel Peace Prize of 2007. So I was stunned to have received that as well, and it was great. Now, then that was 2007. In 2022, I was already starting to plan or think about my retirement. I thought, wow, I'm already mentoring people, so I could talk about that in a moment. But I thought, well, what am I going to do with this big piece of paper? It's in my office. It was in my office. So I thought, it's a good thing to actually donate this. So I donated it to the Chevron Heritage Museum, which is basically the Chevron Archives History Center. And there I wanted to inspire future generations of Chevron scientists and engineers to do great things. It was a complete surprise to me, and I thought, well, the benefit of doing this is not just to me, but really to try to get more people to do great things. You know.
Wow, that's great. It's definitely a great movement, great impact you have there.
Yeah, yeah,
Oh, just to touch back on the IPCC, what do you think
yeah.
of the IPCC process?
I think the IPCC process is a super review process. I'll tell it to you very factually. It really is a super peer review process because it looks at all kinds of literature. And then once they're in, it's the authors, and then me being a review editor. I actually have a couple of roles here. I'll explain that to you in a moment. But the authors, okay, they are nominated by many countries. Yes, there are many experts and scientists and engineers for many years from the richer, wealthier, industrialized countries. But from the very beginning, the UN made sure that the developing world is not neglected, and that as many of the scientists and engineers that they can have nominated from China, India, and other developing countries, Brazil, etc. That as they should all be nominated and hopefully accepted into the process. That's why the IPCC, for the longest time, I know that they have for each working group. There are three working groups: one on science, one on the impacts. Impacts, of course, flow from the science, physical science. And then the third working group three, is all about technologies and policy and about collaboration. So I've always been involved in working group three because I've never been a scientist, okay, as I said in my career, talked about my career. I've never been a scientist. I've always been much more of an engineer. Okay, if I ever was a technical person, I was an engineer, a chemical engineer, and then environmental engineer, as you heard. So I was always involved in working group three about technology and policy, because for so many years now, I've been really involved in policy as well. So I've become a policy expert. Now, the role that I've been put into, and you don't get to choose a role, okay? The bureau at IPCC, they get to accept your nomination and then they get to assign you roles. So the roles I've always gotten is the editing role, review editor. So I'm listed as on a chapter as one of the leaders. So I'm a review editor. My job, I have two main functions. One is to be sure that all comments, all public comments from anywhere, they must all be addressed by the author, all of them. Okay, so for example, I'll just give you an example. The chapter I was in called the Energy System chapter, chapter 6 in the sixth assessment that was just completed in 2024. Chapter 6, Energy System, as one of the two review editors, my partner was a Ministry of Electric Power authority from Ghana. So Mr. Yedu, he's from Ghana. He's my partner. So every chapter has to be co-chaired by a wealthy country, industrialized country, and by a developing country chair. Okay, so it must be done that way. So every working group, every chapter, and then every review editor role, there are two for each chapter, has to be from industrialized country, me, and Mr. Yedu from Ghana. Okay, so that's to provide that kind of balance perspective about the science. Okay, now you might think, well, why does science? Why do you have to have a view of the science? Well, as you know, science is not just data. Science does lend itself to some interpretation as well. So that's why the commenting part of it is very important to the IPCC. Public comments, when they're received, every one of them has to be addressed, and that's one of my roles and my colleagues' role is to make sure every single comment. Chapter 6 received over 5,000 comments in the first round.
Wow.
And then the second comment period received around 3,000. Okay, I think it was 5 and 3. So altogether, I remember it was close to 8,000 comments. Okay, for the two rounds. So I was up a lot, doing a lot of all-nighters to really go through a lot of this. And of course, I have time zone issues with my colleague and friend from Ghana. So we always have to, find the right time to talk as well. So yes, that was my main role. Make sure all comments are addressed fairly, equitably by the lead authors who wrote those sections in chapter 6. That's why each chapter has to have their own review editors, a pair of review editors. So I was just responsible for energy system. And then what happened then is in that process, I also have to my second function is to make sure that when there are disputes amongst the lead authors on certain issues, I'm actually the judge. Okay, how can I be the judge if I'm not completely expert in the area? Well, you can be. Just like Supreme Court justices, they can be, they don't have to be expert, but they can make decisions, right? So, I mean, obviously, Supreme Court justices have to make decisions on the law, but when it comes to science or anything like that, they usually defer. Okay. In my case, I can do some of both, and I have the role of being the judge with my friend, colleague, Mr. Yedu from Ghana. So we could decide on certain issues, and I exercised this role early on in my career, not for the sixth assessment, but on the special report of carbon dioxide capture and geologic storage. I was the review editor of chapter 5. In that was the geologic chapter. I wasn't an expert in the geologist by any means, but there were two issues I had to adjudicate amongst two different groups of authors in that same chapter. They disagree on how much capacity, for example, that the world has in terms of estimate. They also disagreed in terms of what kind of probability for leakage might be. So there were different sets of data and different sets of interpretation. So I waded through all that, and well, guess what? As a good person, as a judge, I actually ultimately wrote my own compromise language for both parties. And I said, look, this is the compromise, take it or leave it. So they both grudgingly took my compromise language. So what you see in the IPCC special report on carbon dioxide capture and geologic storage about those issues on leakage rate and about the capacity of to store. Actually, the language came from me. Now, I didn't do it from vacuum. I did it with the two data sets and interpretation that I saw, and I wrote the best language I could to make them come to a compromise. So.
Right.
So yeah, and I did that too with at the EPA also. So I have that experience as well. When different parties and some of my different team members had different views. As the leader of the team, I also made sure the language would be suitable for everyone's view. Everyone walked away unhappy and happy. So
Yeah, I guess
so I
that's
know how to do that.
how
Okay.
much compromise.
Yeah. So compromise is not a dirty word. In fact, compromise to me in life, you got to do that a lot to move forward in life.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you discussed earlier about the negotiation processes for the UNFCCC. What are the key issues at stake?
Yeah. I think for the longest time, as a business person, okay, I do tell you that, and I should tell you, as a business person, okay, I go to these meetings. I do have certain, I won't call them exactly biases, but I do have certain focus, okay? They're not always biases. They're just focus for me being there to justify why I go there, okay? They're business reasons I go there. I go there to follow something the business sector, the private sector is very interested in terms of technology development and deployment. That's actually one track. Let's see if I can find that here. It's actually one of the, oh, here it is. Well, I can point out to you at least one issue. The matters relating to technology development and transfer. That's actually at the highest level, COP, at the supreme body level. They have to make decisions around 9A, 9B, 9C. Okay, so I follow those issues as a technology and a business person. I follow them closely. So I actually have a room to go to. Um, when the committee of people and countries who are interested, when they want to negotiate this, I follow that particular track and I go to that room and I follow that in the first week, especially in the first week, to observe what they're actually saying, what each country is saying, and how they behave in terms of the technology development and deployment. And over the years, so I'll just give you an example, just a taste of this. Over the years, I've noted very clearly that countries such as India, and this is not to embarrass anybody or anything. I mean, these countries know what they do. India always wanted low cost or free intellectual property. They basically want everyone else to deploy technologies that have either no intellectual property or give them the right, give the country and the country's companies and industry the right to practice all of that without any cost. Okay, so I've noticed that, and China too, in very similar ways. Although China is starting to veer off from India because China itself is creating and inventing more things. But so IP protection in certain countries are very weak, and they carry that through in their national position, international global negotiating position by trying to weaken the IP system and wanting to have climate technologies and all that to be free and be deployed in their country. Now, one can argue, and they do, that climate change is a serious matter. We should all share technologies, and yes, and that to some degree is what the what this paragraph 9, this decision 9 ought to be. It is about that, but weakening IP protection is not always the right way to go. There should be other ways to think about this, because once you start weakening IP protection, then you decrease the level of incentives for people to want to invent something. So there's a balance you got to seek there, and certain parties, certain countries always want that balance to be tilted this way rather than the other way. So anyway, so I noticed things like that. So that's one of the issues I follow very closely. And there's another issue, not at this COP level, but at one of the other, uh, for example, um, well, anyway, about Article 6, about international emission trading. I don't see it immediately on here, but it is one of the things one of those issues I really follow very closely as well. And that has to do with, oh, here it is, right here. This is, in fact, this one is the provisional agenda for SBSTA. So as I explained earlier, SBSTA is the professional level. They're not the ministerial level. The professional level, people like me would would argue over, debate over, and finally agree to some negotiating text around things like matters relating to technology transfer, matters relating to Article 6, which has to do with a cooperative approach, sharing emission credits and all that, so that if one country cannot reduce all of its emissions by physically reducing it, they can buy emission offsets or carbon offsets from another country that can generate them, so that you can overall globally achieve a certain emission level. Okay, so that's Article 6. There's still issues around Article 6. And I've been following that religiously because I've been a member of the board of directors of the International Emission Trading Association as well. I believe in technology for sure, but I also believe in policies that help to incentivize such technology development, which include market-based mechanisms such as emission trading. Okay, so if you read my biography, you know that I'm very passionate about that too. Not only technology, but also about markets and especially carbon markets. Okay, so yeah, I hope I answered the question. I kind of lost track of the original question.
Yeah, no, that was great. Thank you.
Okay.
So I think the UNFCCC meetings are in, you said late November, early December, and I think
Yeah.
that's one coming up. So what would you like the audience to expect from the next round of negotiations?
Yes. In fact, I was just let me see. Okay, this is at the professional level. Let me go back to the high level agenda. Okay. The most important, I mean, there are all sorts of things. There's adaptation, adapting to climate change, global stock take. These are all the reason why they're on this agenda list is because they're important. But one of the most controversial, I would say, is this one. There's two of them. They're very controversial. One is called loss and damage. Okay, that one is like one bucket of money for. There are three buckets of money in the whole climate change arena. One bucket of money is about money that would be collected from the wealthier countries to help the poorer countries to reduce emissions. Okay, that bucket of money has something called the Global Environment Facility that's been around since 1996 or seven. And then there's a more recent one from the Paris Agreement called the Green Climate Fund. So those two lending agencies, if you will, they actually do lend money and also grant money. Okay, those two agencies were created under the UNFCCC and under the Paris Agreement. So that one bucket of money is all about reducing emissions. There's another bucket of money that's financed by by emission trading. So emission trading there's a tax on emission trading. That tax could be as much as 5% now, but used to be 2% from any trade between countries. And that adaptation fund would take that money from the trading and fund adaptation projects by countries. Okay. A third bucket now that's been agreed to at COP27, a third bucket of money that's been agreed to is the so-called loss and damage, the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. That to me functions kind of like an insurance policy, an insurance fund. Okay, so imagine you own a car you get into an accident or something, or it gets vandalized, whatever. So you go claim, right? You go into your insurance agent and file a claim. That's exactly what this will do. There's been impact on your country. You can go file a claim, if you will, to this loss and damage fund. Now, as a provision of the Paris Agreement now, the loss and damage fund, uh, it's been created, but there's no money in it yet, or very little money. I think the last time I checked, there may be several $100 million in it. Okay, not too much money. Several $100 million sounds like a lot of money, but as you know, any one single hurricane or sea level rise or whatever event, storm surge, $1 billion can be, it's not unheard of for just one event. So several $100 million is what they were able to do at UAE. They got that, but more will have to be collected. And not only that, not only money, but the fund itself. Again, imagine you're an insurance company. How do you make a claim? What are the criteria and the process for making a claim? What justifies that claim to be real and to be funded? Okay, so all those criteria, what's called in UN language called modalities and procedures, the modalities and procedures have not been completed at all. In fact, they just started doing this. So loss and damage fund is that third bucket. Mitigation is reducing emissions, adaptation, and now this insurance fund called loss and damage. It's been agreed to, and that was a big, big uh, compromise because, again, big countries like United States and the EU, and to some extent even China, I think, objected to having the loss and damage fund. They don't want it. Okay. The reason is actually fairly straightforward. The only reason why the US and the EU finally relented at COP27 was because the other countries, most of the developing countries, G77 and China, decided to relent on their position that there could be liabilities. Okay. Now, countries, to be legally liable, then all of a sudden has to be adjudicated into international law courts like The Hague. Okay, so the U.S. doesn't want to be held liable. The EU doesn't want to be held liable, and none of the industrialized countries want to be held liable for anything else. Okay, so when those countries relented on that requirement, then the EU and the U.S. finally agreed. Okay, so.
Thank you.
Okay. Did I answer that question?
Yeah.
Yeah, there was some. Yeah. Anyway, so that's why I show this agenda. It's the COP agenda, but then there's several meetings going on at the same time. Okay, and this is one of them. Actually, I didn't even address the biggest issue. The biggest issue is it's actually on the COP. Yeah, it should be on the COP right here. It should be right here. Oh, right here. Matters relating to long-term finance. It's right here, long-term climate finance. Under that, there's a whole raft of issues on the so-called what's called New Collective Quantified Goal, NCQG. I know the acronym from negotiators. NCQG, New Collective Quantified Goal. Because in 2015, the countries all agreed in Paris in 2015 that they would put up $100 billion per year uh, for this climate finance. Okay, this would be on top of whatever the global this Green Climate Fund already has. They would agree to $100 billion more to that. Now, however, what's happened since 2015 is that the OECD countries, all the industrialized countries, were only able to come up with 80 or 90 billion the last time I checked, maybe even close to 100, but not per year. Okay, they're able to come up with that money, but not per year. Okay, so Under the Paris Agreement, there's actually an article. This is a main provision. Paris Agreement requires that all the countries have to come back with this new collective quantified goal, NCQG, by 2025. So, sorry, no, it's actually this year, 2024. By 2024, they must agree to a new goal. And this goal must be higher than the floor that was agreed to. So it has to be higher than $100 billion per year. Okay. So there's been a lot of talk already, and this is the major sticking point. I don't go to the cops anymore, but from news reports and hearing what some of my former colleagues have been telling me, this is the most controversial of all of the negotiating issues. Okay, uh, because no one wants to, none of the wealthy countries want to come up with more than $100 billion a year when they couldn't even come up with $100 billion in total, okay,
Yeah.
cumulative. So to negotiate for $300 billion, $500 billion, and according to some analysts, it could be as much as $3 trillion per year. Okay, can you imagine a $3 trillion fund?
Yeah.
Okay, okay, so this issue at Baku will be the headline issue. Okay, I have no doubt it will be the headline issue. If it fails, it would really mark a huge failure for COP. Okay, there may be other successes on all these other issues, but that will be the newspapers. Okay, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and etc. will headline this as big failure at COP. Okay, so I'm sure that that would be the way that it will be characterized if it's a failure. Now, if there is some interim or compromise or something. Uh, and these diplomats, they're diplomats because they're good at their jobs. In papering over differences, or they kick the can down the road further or something. And so that decision would not be made at this COP, but at the next COP or following two COPs, whatever. So they could do that too, and they could say, well, we've we've established what's called work program. Okay. Now, if you ever hear the word work program in a UN setting, you should know this, okay? Work program means we don't agree. The countries actually don't agree, but we agree to disagree and we agree to work on it. And so that's what a work program actually means in UN language. So they could have a work program, possibly. Or they could agree to a much smaller number, instead of 100 billion, it could be 300 billion. But I have a feeling it could come down to the wire on the last day of the second week, and then it'll go overtime. Just as all the cops I've been to, that's another thing I should tell you. All the cops I've been to, they've all gone overtime. The Paris Agreement was actually not actually one of the longest, but it went to almost 70 hours. The last COP, COP 2027, went to two and a half days, so it was still pretty long. But the longest COP that I've ever been to was actually at COP 17 in in South Africa. What the heck was anyway in South Africa, and that COP was the COP that established the track of negotiating towards the Paris Agreement. So COP 21 was Paris, COP 17 was in South Africa. So that went over to 72 hours. It was very long. But anyway, so I can predict almost predict again. If history is any guide, there will be an overtime period, at least 48 hours, if not longer. Okay. Anyway, so that's the art of negotiations, art of the possible, from a chemical engineer who saw all this at COP5 in Bonn, and my whole life changed. My whole worldview changed because I finally saw how the UN actually works. And I'm not being cynical at all. It is the only way that it could work, um, without invasions, without fighting a war. Okay, it's the only way it can work when 180 plus countries all have to agree. Okay. And when the global atmosphere is everyone's commons, it's the only way that it could work. There's no executive committee. Okay.
Yeah.
There's no, yeah, a lot of places are XCOM or something. And the UN Security Council is not part of this. UN Security Council is a different process. That's war and peace. And, that's like 20 members, 5 permanent members of the nuclear weapons states. Okay, that's a different beast, different animal altogether. That can make executive decisions with some General Assembly, rubber stamping approval. But in the UNFCCC case, this UN process is completely different. All countries have a say. Every single one wants their say. No voting. Okay, so it's an amazing process to me. Even after 20 plus years of 25 years of looking at this, I'm still amazed at how it all works. Yeah. So anyway,
Yeah, the process aims to build global consensus, right? It's the art of compromise. Everyone gets some of what they want to agree not to object. There's no executive committee, and every country, of which there's almost 184, they all have a voice, and they meet every year, 2 weeks in length, which can sometimes get extended depending on how long the meetings go on for. The US and the EU actually objected to the voting proposal.
Yeah, and the climate policy interests started with interest in reforestation, actually, in Indonesia, and after the Kyoto Protocol was ratified in the late 1990s.
So the COP5 in 1999 in Bonn, Germany, was the first UN-related meeting that Dr. Lee attended, which is and now we're coming up with COP30 in Baku.
Yeah, I think what we heard in this episode was that implementation is the hard work. So the subsidiary bodies, for implementation, for the scientific technological advice, the focus is really to do the detailed negotiations beforehand, which I think is what we really highlighted with Arthur this episode.
And sometimes there's even conflict over small ways of saying things, like over the phrase phase out of coal versus phase down of coal. China and India objected to that heavily at the COP meeting in Glasgow.
Yeah, and the G77 plus China bloc, how they always speak first. And also the 7-year assessment repeating process by the IPCC. We get to really peel back the curtains this episode and see how the processes go.
Absolutely. It's very interesting to see how the diplomats negotiate, because they're the ones who help resolve differences, as the presidencies must be neutral, right?
Yeah, and even considering, the most consensus issues is finance, right? It's not only trying to stay neutral, but including, a goal of $100 billion per year.
Yeah, and once you start going to these meetings and understanding what's happening there, you can kind of tell by the wording what things actually mean, right? Like work program in UN speak is, we don't agree, but we agree to disagree, but we agree to keep working on an issue.
I think it's amazing that we got a look behind the scenes from someone involved in this process for decades, not just one particular meeting on one particular set of issues. To think a group of 184 countries that has to come to a consensus with no voting is kind of mind-blowing. But that's what we get when we trying to talk about a global process. There's no planet B. We have to solve this for the planet we got.
Some experts talk about the idea of peak oil. When the world's demand for fossil fuels finally begins to decline and other energy sources, like renewables, begin to have a large role in our energy mix. But are we ready for that?
Well, the concept of peak oil was first written about in 1956 in a paper by Ab King Hubbard. He was a petroleum geologist, and his prediction was a little bit off. He presented a formal theory that said that we would have peak oil uh, in around 1965 to 1971. But now, today, as we all know, demand for oil and natural gas is still growing and is projected to keep growing in the future.
Yeah, and another great quote is by former Saudi oil minister and OPEC chair, and who said, "The Stone Age didn't end when we ran out of stones. and the oil age won't end when we run out of oil. The key is energy demand and the pros and cons of alternative energy sources.
I guess it's back to the economics 101, right? It's the supply and demand curves. Experts disagree about the future of oil and natural gas. Some see a peak or a plateau in the upcoming decade, and others don't see a peak oil demand on the horizon at all, right? I wonder what our experts think. We have Chris Wright, the CEO of Liberty Energy Solutions, and Kyle Corner to discuss whether we are even asking the right questions.
And there's just no chance people are going to lock in. I'm going to stay in poverty. I'm not going to get clean cooking fuel. I'm not going to have kids with access to modern medicine and more opportunities in their life. Because if I don't do that and everyone else does the same thing, the world will be a few tenths of a degree cooler at the end of the century. Like very few people are going to make that decision. And so the answer I get back to people is, well, then we in the rich country, if we show the way, then people will follow the way. The problem is, if I look at the leaders right now, Germany, the United Kingdom, California, they made energy expensive. They made energy unreliable. The energy intensive manufacturing and the blue collar jobs that go with it have just left those locales to somewhere else. They made their people poorer, reduced their standard of living. Heck, California, with everything in the world going for it, has the highest adjusted poverty rate of any state in the nation. People aren't going to follow that. That's not a model that'll be adopted and taken wider. So this to me is a little bit too much of just the politicization of energy. Do we want a cleaner energy system? Do we want to be aware of and address climate change? Absolutely. The world's been decarbonizing for 200 years, from wood to coal to oil to gas to nuclear. That's naturally happening. The biggest source of reduced greenhouse gas emission and pollutants in the atmosphere. For the African families, a bigger thing is the liberation of women. Women have to either spend hours either gathering wood, or if it's charcoal, then they can buy it in bundles, but they've got to heat it and stoke that fire up to a high enough flame to cook, and then tamp that fire down so they don't waste all the charcoal before the next cooking or the evening heating. So it's liberating for the time of women. It's dramatically cleaner air inside. To me, it's just an absolute home run. And for tens of dollars of investment into our lending fund, you transition a family that takes the biggest step from abject poverty to lifestyles like you and I, is those hours back, that clean air back, that freedom back by having a propane cook stove that they can turn on and turn off. Yeah, indeed. We've really lived in and still are living in a crazy time. I mean, countless oil and gas companies have pledged net zero by 2050 or 50% reductions. Um, to me, it just meant they never looked into the economics of you should not be proud of spending dollars to turn them into nickels or dimes. That's not good for your business. That's not good for society. And if you look at the climate economics, you would understand you're making impoverishing proclamations that are impractical anyway, and they're all going to be walked back. I get challenged by publications about why don't I have a net zero commitment? And my comeback is because I'm not for impoverishing the world. I want to improve the world. And of course, I wouldn't commit to such a foolish goal.
And some of the criteria that the lenders, the World Bank and others were setting up to somehow reward these things are now crumbling down, and people are saying, I don't want that anymore. State of Texas is not buying into that in terms of the companies that it invests in.
Right.
So it's the story's starting to unravel a bit.
Yes.
It's shocking how these ESG scores just took over everybody's lives. Companies and countries made decisions. Sri Lanka wanted to have a high ESG score, and so that precipitated their eradication of nitrogen-based fertilizers, which is shocking to me how that came on the scene and just was able to govern decisions around the world for so long.
Thank you so much for joining us for the future of energy. Special thanks to each of our guests today and to our technical wizard, Abhi, for his important contributions to this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast so you can automatically get access to all our new episodes. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.